A laborer steps off the finished timber and onto an iron rod hanging over Kinzua Creek Valley. Under his boots there is no platform, no scaffold, and no net, only a narrow member leading out into open air, while steam hoists above him tighten and rattle. Below him, the creek and the cut stone piers are nearly 300 feet down. Around him, other men haul up wrought iron sections with block and tackle, trying to set a bridge panel in place before the suspended weight starts to swing. If a rope parts, if a connection misses its bolts, if one man loses his footing, the whole method stops in mid-air. That was the problem in northwestern Pennsylvania in 1882. A railroad wanted a direct line across the Kinzua Valley to move coal, timber, and oil country traffic toward Buffalo and the Great Lakes, but the alternative to crossing the gorge was a longer route with heavier grades and lost time. The answer was to throw a railroad viaduct straight across the valley, more than 2,000 feet long and 301 feet above the creek. The famous figure attached to the job is a crew of 40 men, though some records count a larger workforce once masons, quarrymen, and transport hands are included. Either way, the iron erection itself moved with astonishing speed, 94 working days. The valley was not empty wilderness in the romantic sense. It was a transport problem sitting between raw materials and paying customers. By the early 1880s, Buffalo's industries and lake shipping routes were hungry for Pennsylvania coal, and the railroad had every reason to cut distance, reduce grades, and move tonnage faster. In the rough country south of Bradford, every extra mile of track meant more grading, more fuel, more time, and lower profit on every carload. The men who approved the project mattered mainly because they chose the shortest and hardest route. Railroad leadership concluded that skirting the valley would cost them distance and operating efficiency they did not want to lose. Engineers under Octave Chanute and Oliver Barnes settled on the direct crossing. The fabrication and erection work went to the Phoenix Bridge interests in eastern Pennsylvania, where prefabricated iron bridges were already becoming one of the great industrial products of the age. The structure they chose was bold, but it was not reckless. The original Kinzua Viaduct used 20 iron towers, each made of 4 wrought iron columns, carrying a line of deck trusses across the gorge. The key element was the patented Phoenix column, a built-up tubular wrought iron member designed to be lighter than a cast iron column of similar strength, while resisting buckling and vibration far better than many older forms. That mattered here because height was the whole challenge. The tallest tower spread to more than 100 feet at the base, but high in the air the roadbed stayed only about 10 feet wide. Before any iron went up, crews spent months making the bridge's feet. Stone for the piers was quarried locally from the hills around the site. Roughly 7,600 cubic yards of sandstone went into the masonry, with some foundations extending as much as 35 feet below ground and rising well above the surface to meet the tower bases. In all, 110 masonry piers had to be prepared and aligned, each one ready to receive long anchor bolts that would fasten the ironwork to the stone. That stage of the job was labor in the oldest sense of the word. Men quarried, split, moved, dressed, and set stone in a landscape with little forgiveness and no shortcut except endurance. Every foundation had to be right, because a small error at ground level would multiply itself into a serious problem 300 feet up. The bridge's speed in 1882 was made possible only because the slow, heavy work below had already been done. The iron itself arrived as something close to an industrial kit. At the Phoenix Works, sections had been fabricated and fitted before shipment, so the field crews would not have to remake parts on the edge of the gorge. That mattered more than any heroic speech. Out in the valley there was no room for leisurely correction. A member that did not line up where it was supposed to line up could leave men hanging over open air with several hundred pounds of iron swaying on a rope. The first tower was the hardest because nothing yet existed to build from. Workers used a gin pole to raise the initial ironwork. Once that first tower stood, they turned the completed work into their machine. A wooden traveling crane was built at the top, and from there the crew advanced tower by tower, using the finished portion of the bridge as the platform for building the unfinished portion. That decision removed the need for full scaffolding in the gorge and made the entire enterprise possible at the speed the railroad demanded. This is the part that sounds impossible until the details make it physical. There were 2 steam hoists, there were blocks, tackle, and tens of miles of manila rope. There were iron rods supporting work between towers, and men moved back and forth across them carrying tools, guiding members, and making connections where a slip would have meant a very long fall. Contemporary accounts stressed the absence of scaffolding and even the lack of ladders. The workers climbed the structure itself, so the viaduct rose the way a climbing crew advances up a cliff face, except the cliff was being built at the same time. One tower went up, then the crane moved, then the next tower, then the truss works between them, then farther out again. Every completed panel gave the crew one more place to stand, and one more chance to extend the line into the empty space over the valley. The pace was not abstract. Some local accounts placed the main ironworking gang at 36 laborers and 4 foremen, with common wages around $2 to $3 a day, and foremen making $5 to $6. Those numbers do not sound large until you put them beside the risk. A day's pay bought a man's place high above the gorge, working on iron members that could not wait for calm nerves or careful weather. He climbed because delay cost the company money, and because this was the kind of work that existed for men willing to trade danger for steady wages. And yet the men were not passive victims in the story. They were the method, the prefabricated ironwork, the phoenix columns, the hoists, the rope, the gin pole, the traveling crane. None of it mattered without men who could read a piece by eye, hold it steady on a line, bolt it home, and then climb out to do it again. Engineering narrowed the odds. Labor closed the distance. By late August 1882, after 94 working days of iron erection, the bridge was complete. The original viaduct stood about 2,053 feet long, 301.5 feet high at its maximum, and weighed just over 3.1 million pounds of iron. When trains began crossing, it was the highest and longest railroad bridge in the world. The line that had once been a stubborn valley problem became a track in the sky. The achievement looked clean from a distance, but the bridge's daily life was never calm. Wind came hard through Kinzua Gorge. Railroad men later recalled gusts strong enough to blow loads of hemlock bark off cars and even tear at boxcar roofs. Train speeds over the viaduct were restricted. On a still day, the bridge was a marvel. In weather, it was a reminder that the structure had been built in one of the worst places in the region for anything tall and lightly framed. That mattered because the bridge had been built for the railroad of 1882, not the railroad that arrived a generation later. When the original structure opened, consolidation locomotives weighed a little over 103,000 pounds, and the coal cars it carried were much smaller than the rolling stock that would follow. By 1900, locomotives were approaching 190,000 pounds, and freight cars of 100,000 pound capacity were becoming part of normal traffic. The bridge had not failed. The industry had simply outgrown it. So after only 18 years, the railroad made a brutal decision that tells you everything about the age. It would rebuild the whole viaduct in steel. Not nearby, not after abandoning the route. Right there on the same foundations, in roughly the same dimensions, while using the old line as part of the means to replace itself. A bridge that had once been the solution now became the work platform for its own obsolescence. The 1900 reconstruction was another labor epic. About 100 to 150 men, working long shifts, rebuilt the structure in roughly 105 days. 2 enormous timber travelers, each spanning 3 towers, worked in from both ends. The middle tower beneath each traveler could be dismantled, while the machine rested on the towers to either side. Then the new steel tower went up in its place, the traveler crept forward, and the process repeated itself. This was not gentler work just because it came later. Riveting gangs had to align heavy steel members high above the valley, heat rivets, drive them home, and maintain pace under a deadline that the railroad had no intention of relaxing. During the reconstruction there was also a strike. Around 100 riveters and a loftman walked out, pressing for higher hourly wages. They were soon back on the job at a compromise rate, but the episode cuts through the triumphal language that often surrounds these projects. Men knew exactly how dangerous the work was, and they knew what their labor was worth. The second viaduct weighed more than twice as much as the first, roughly 6.7 million pounds. It was stronger, stiffer, and designed to resist far greater loads. Engineers also took the wind more seriously, calculating the steel structure for substantial lateral pressure when loaded, and even greater pressure when unloaded. The bridge that emerged in 1900 looked broadly similar from afar, but the world that produced it had already changed. The railroad now demanded more tonnage, heavier power, and tighter reliability than the elegant iron bridge of 1882 could give. One decision from that reconstruction would matter later. The railroad reused parts of the original anchor system buried in the old masonry. The 1900 structure was new steel above ground, but elements of the 19th century fastening system remained at the foundations, adapted through collar couplings because the original bolts were too short for the new work. That saved time and took advantage of existing foundations. It also left a weakness hidden where no passenger admiring the view could see it. For decades, the bridge did exactly what the railroad needed. Coal, timber, and oil country traffic crossed Kinzua Gorge, and excursion trains later carried sightseers over a structure that felt less like ordinary travel than suspended motion through empty space. People came in their best clothes to cross it. They came because it was useful, and then because it was famous, and finally because it was both. The human relationship to the bridge shifted with the economy around it. Freight traffic declined and eventually ended. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania bought the viaduct and surrounding land in the 1960s, and Kinzua Bridge State Park opened in 1970. In 1977, the bridge was recognized as a historic civil engineering landmark. Beginning in 1987, excursion trains once again rolled onto the structure, letting visitors feel a fraction of what earlier generations had felt when the valley opened beneath them. But preservation is also labor, and by the early 2000s, inspectors found a problem far less glamorous than the bridge's silhouette. Rust had eaten deep into parts of the steel. The bridge was closed first to trains and then to pedestrians. Rehabilitation began in 2003. Workers from a specialist bridge company climbed the towers, installed repairs, and did the kind of dirty, methodical work that historic preservation usually requires: cleaning, fitting, bracing, replacing, coaxing another generation of life out of old metal. Then the bridge met the one test none of its builders had been able to finish permanently. On July 21, 2003, a severe storm system moved across northwestern Pennsylvania. Around mid-afternoon, tornado winds struck the viaduct. In roughly half a minute, 11 of the 20 towers collapsed. Trees were uprooted. Giant steel members were thrown to the valley floor. A structure that had stood through a century of weather and traffic went down in a sequence of violent booms. The tornado did not simply overpower a perfect bridge. The forensic investigation that followed found that the hidden foundation connections were already compromised. Corrosion and fatigue had badly weakened collar coupling assemblies and anchor bolts. Many of them deteriorated long before the storm. Investigators concluded that the structure could not withstand winds around 94 miles per hour because critical elements at the bearings and anchorages had lost their capacity over decades of loading. The storm was the blow that the weakened connection could no longer absorb. That ending throws a hard light backward across the whole story. The men of 1882 had solved the immediate problem brilliantly. The rebuilders of 1900 had solved the next problem with equal skill. Neither generation was foolish. Both were working inside the material knowledge, economic pressure, and railroad demands of their own time, But infrastructure does not stop being a labor story when the ribbon is cut. Someone has to inspect it, paint it, repair it, and argue for its survival long after the original builders are gone. Today, the Kinzua site preserves that truth in steel and open space. Part of the remaining bridge was converted into a pedestrian skywalk that leads visitors out over the valley on the surviving towers, with an observation deck high above the creek. The wreckage of the fallen spans remains below, twisted where the tornado left it. You can read the whole life of the viaduct there at once, the original ambition, the rebuild, the neglect, the attempted rescue, and the collapse. That is what makes the bridge more powerful now than when it stood intact in old postcards. The site does not let the achievement turn into a smooth legend. It shows the broken members on the valley floor. It shows how much iron and labor it took to raise the line in the first place, and it shows how thin the margin can be between durability and failure when an entire transportation system depends on a few bolts buried in stone. Go back to that worker on the iron rod in 1882. He is not a statue in a park brochure. He is one of the men who made the bridge possible by trusting a rope, a hoist, a pre-fitted member, and the competence of the crew around him. He climbs out over the void because the railroad wants coal in Buffalo, because the valley has to be crossed somewhere, and because his wages depend on the next piece fitting where it should. The bridge begins there, not with the finished silhouette, but with a body balanced over empty air. And when you stand on the skywalk now, looking past the surviving steel to the wreckage below, that is still the clearest way to see it. Not as an abstract wonder, and not as a ruin by itself, but as accumulated labor, quarrymen in sandstone cuttings, ironworkers on rods with no scaffolding under them, riveters in the 1900 rebuild, inspectors climbing tower after tower, and preservation crews trying to save one more generation of service from an aging structure.